thesis of the book is that what ails you and me has nothing to do with being sick or being wrong. What ails us is that we are living our life as amateurs. The solution this book suggests is that we turn pro. What we get when we turn pro is we find our power, we find our will and our voice, and we find our self-respect. We become who we always were, but had until then been afraid to embrace and to live out. Well, that is an excerpt from Steven Pressfield's book, Turning Pro. And welcome to episode 3 of the Good Reads podcast, Good Reads for a Better Life. And if you haven't tuned into episode 1 yet, make sure you go back and watch episode 1 because I shared The War of Art by Steven Pressfield. And this is the follow-up to The War of Art called Turning Pro. And then episode 4, I'm going to do the follow-up to Turning Pro, which is called Do Work. So these are kind of a trilogy that Steven Pressfield wrote. I told you in episode 1 that Steven Pressfield is one of my all-time favorite authors, and he writes mostly fiction, but his nonfiction books are actually the ones that I love the most. And in The War of Art, he really defines this problem that he says we all have, and he calls it resistance. And resistance is this internal, powerful force that is always trying to lead us towards self-sabotage. And what it's ultimately trying to sabotage is our potential, is our unique calling, our unique contribution to the world. And so what Steven Pressfield says is your ultimate calling will always be through overcoming resistance. And that is a constant battle. And ultimately, he says that the way that we overcome resistance is that we learn to live life not as an amateur, but life as a pro. And so Turning Pro now he's still going to talk quite a bit about the diagnosis of the problem and how it shows up, but he's also going to spend time talking about what does it look like, what does it mean to live as a pro. So I hope that's helpful to you. It's been very helpful to me. And he begins this story by just his own life. He had always known that his calling was to be a writer, but up until his 40s, he avoided that calling. And he created this miserable life that he wasn't happy with. He was a truck driver. He was in and out of relationships. He was undisciplined. But all of it, he said, was ultimately the result of fighting against the true thing that he was supposed to do, which is become a writer. He said, everything I was doing in my outer life was a consequence and an expression of that terror and that shame. And the terror and shame he's referring to is the terror and shame of not living up to that calling. And because he wasn't living up to that calling, he had this constant sense of inadequacy, of missing the mark, of all that sort of thing. And he begins to explain this more. He calls it shadow careers. He says sometimes when we're afraid of embracing our true calling, we'll pursue a shadow calling instead. That shadow career is a metaphor for our real career. Its shape is similar. Its contours feel tantalizingly the same. But a shadow career entails no real risk. If we fail at a shadow career, the consequences are meaningless to us. He says, if you're dissatisfied with your current life, ask yourself what your current life is a metaphor for. That metaphor will point you towards your true calling. And that whole idea of a shadow life or a shadow mission or a shadow career is so powerful to me because I think that's what we do. In place of our true calling, we craft out a calling that's safer, that requires a little bit less, that we feel like we can get both worlds of that inner satisfaction, but without the risk and the exposure and the challenge of our true calling. But in the end, it never works out that way. He says, in the shadow life, we live in denial and we act by addiction. We pursue callings that take us nowhere and permit ourselves to be controlled by compulsions that we cannot understand or are not aware of, and whose outcomes serve only to keep us caged, unconscious, and going nowhere. And I just find that paragraph fascinating because I look at my own life and I can see times where I resisted and avoided what I believe is God's true calling on my life. And what it does is it does create room for addictions and unhealthy habits and unhealthy desires and compulsions to begin to take life into form in our life. And I wonder how many of us are struggling with certain behaviors and we're trying to manage the behavior, but what we really need to do is move out of the shadow life and into the true purpose and calling that God has, because there's something so powerful about purpose and how it changes how we live, it changes how we act, it changes how we organize our day. Stephen Pressfield's going to talk a tremendous amount about this, and it becomes this healthy force in our life that begins to root out a lot of the unhealthy addictions and struggles. And I would say to maybe those who are listening who are struggling with addiction to obviously get help, number one, with your addiction. Go to AA, whatever, go to Overcomers, whatever your addiction might be, get help. You always need a community to overcome it, but also clarify purpose in your life. Begin to explore that with God and see how much of these unhealthy behaviors are ultimately an avoidance strategy. Because that's what Pressfield is going to say. A lot of the unhealthy and self-sabotaging habits and practices in our life is just truly an avoidance strategy, which I think is fascinating and worth thinking about. He goes on, he talks about habits. The difference between an amateur and a professional is in their habits. An amateur has amateur habits. A professional has professional habits. We can never free ourselves from habits. That line is so powerful to me, right? You and I are a culmination of our habits, for better or worse. I think we all live under this mythology that I can do whatever I want on a daily basis and still get the end results, the end outcomes in my life that I desire. But the reality is, if your habits aren't aligned with your end desire and end outcome, you won't get there. Because he says at the end of the day, the human being is a creature of habit. We can replace bad habits with good ones. We can trade in the habits of the amateur and the addict for the practice of the professional and the committed artist or entrepreneur. So we have to trade them. We have to replace them, and we have to make sure they're aligned with the true direction that we want to go in life, because we won't outpace our habits. He goes on, he talks more about addiction, distractions, displacement activities. When we're living as amateurs, we're running away from our calling, meaning our work, our destiny, the obligation become our truest and highest selves. Addiction becomes a surrogate for our calling. We enact the addiction instead of embracing the calling. And this line right here is so powerful to me. Why? Because to follow a calling requires work. It's hard. It hurts. It demands entering the pain zone of effort, risk, and exposure. And I love those lines because there's the struggle right there. Ultimately, what he's saying is we will pursue a lesser life because your true calling, my true calling, will demand the most out of us, the most growth, the most maturity, the most discipline, the most focus. And sometimes we know that intuitively, unconsciously. And because we may not be in a place where we are willing to pay the price, we'll say, can I work out some side deal? Can I still have inner satisfaction in life without the pursuit of true calling and just kind of make it all work? But at the end, it never does work. And I love what Os Guinness says, another great author. He says that your true calling is the greatest path of courage in our lives. That, in other words, it will require the most out of our soul, of our capabilities, and that's what makes it so daunting to embrace it. Because you cannot live in complacency, in excuses, in blame, but you have to be full in owning your life and moving forward with God's help. But at the end of the day, it is infinitely better than any alternative. And he goes on to just elaborate a little bit more on the amateur life. He talks about that at times as he would begin to close in on making that big change in his life, to go from kind of not writing and doing all these other things and being distracted, he said he would get very close to it, but then he would pull the pin, is the language that he used. He said, I could relate to pulling the pin. I pulled the pin on my first book 99.9% of the way through. I pulled the pin on my marriage. I'd never done anything in my life to that point where I hadn't pulled the pin. Said I was determined now, though, not to pull the pin. And I've seen that in myself too, that there is a part of us that fears success, that fears really fully embracing that true calling. And sometimes we're so afraid to embrace it and fail in it that we would rather fail before we even try, if that makes sense. We would rather not endure the possibility of failing in this thing that is deep in our hearts. And so we'll say, well, I'm not even going to try. I'm not even going to let myself get to the starting line. I'm going to pull the pin before. And many times the closer you and I are to that true north, to that target, to that center, the more real that desire might be to just give up before we begin. So I know that sounds negative, but I hope that encourages some of you, because maybe some of us are ready to give up on a marriage, on a career, on a dream. And the reason is because we're so close to actually being in the space that we need to. And I just want to encourage you to keep going. He goes on to talk more about addiction in the amateur life. He says, all addictions share, among others, two primary qualities. Number one, they embody repetition without progress. Repetition without progress. And two, they produce incapacity as a payoff. Now, those two filters are really powerful when you run your daily habits through them. So what are the things in my life that are repetitive but don't create any progress? What are the things that I'm doing routinely because they're part of my life, they're a habitual part of my life, but they don't actually make any progress? And then secondly, the other filter is, what are the habits that I do that actually end up producing incapacity? They make me less capable than I was before I was doing them. Because those are two filters to say, okay, these are where I am shooting myself in the foot. These are where I am not going on this journey of turning pro, but I'm remaining an amateur. So, for example, and these can be habits. I love these filters because they kind of take away either the morality of the habit, and obviously immoral habits we want to cut out, but there's a lot of habits in life that are just sort of gray. Like, I know I like to, watch a lot of Netflix. I'm not opposed to binge watching a good show. And you could say, well, that habit, it's not the best use of time, but maybe it's a good way to let off some steam or to mentally decompress or whatever. But when I think about that habit in my life, it actually makes me more incapable of what I believe God's calling me to do, because it just puts me in a lethargic, passive state of mind. And so when I run it through these filters, it's like, yeah, that is actually producing incapacity, because I rarely ever get up from a binge watch session and like, I want to study, I want to read, I want to lead well, things that are kind of important to my calling. I want to connect to God. I just usually feel like I want more passivity and I want more entertainment, and that's not helping me move forward. So it's an interesting way to think about habits. It's helpful to me. I hope it's helpful to you. Then I love this part. This I thought was so powerful. He says, resistance hates two qualities above all: concentration and depth. So let that sink in for a second. Concentration and depth. Why? Because when we work with focus and we work deep, we succeed. And remember, resistance doesn't want you to succeed in what's ultimately important. He says resistance wants to keep us shallow and unfocused, so it makes the superficial and the vain intoxicating. That line right there is worth the whole price of this book. It makes the superficial and the vain intoxicating. That's why scrolling on social media, it's intoxicating, right? We can spend hours doing it without even realizing we're doing it because we've been intoxicated by it. But what has it done? It's kept us from concentrating. It's kept us from depth. It's kept us from doing the real work we have to do. And I think in our world, we are horrible at concentrating. We're horrible at deep work. because it takes stillness, it takes quiet, it takes focus. And these are ultimately the qualities that create a life of real excellence. And whenever I read that, I am so motivated to get a better handle on my abuse of technology, my intoxication with technology and all that, and to live a more disciplined, a more deep, and a more focused life. And I hope it motivates you in the same way. At some point, I'm going to do an episode on Cal Newport's digital minimalism, which I think I mentioned in a previous episode, but it is absolutely fantastic and has a great game plan about how to manage our relationship with technology in a healthy way. Now, he spends a lot of time defining the amateur. Just a couple things that I liked about the amateur. He says the amateur lives in the past. The payoff of living in the past or the future is you never have to do your work in the present. So the amateur, again, he can get caught up, she can get caught up in looking at the past, all the coulda, shoulda, wouldas, right? And I know I can go there. They can also get caught up in looking at the future. Wouldn't it be great if? And I think there's room in our lives to reflect on the past in a healthy way, to envision a better future. But I think his point still stands, that those can, again, be avoidance strategies, right? If I'm thinking about the past or I'm thinking about the future, here's what I'm not doing. Thinking about now, which is all I have, right? The future is not guaranteed. The past I can't change. But what I do right now with the time and opportunity I have, that is what is going to make the most difference. And what does resistance want to do? It wants to take that away from you. So you're not utilizing all that you have, which is the present, right? Tomorrow isn't guaranteed. Yesterday I can't do anything about. But right now, that's where the power is, and that's where my focus has to be. He says the amateur will be ready tomorrow. Now this is saying this facetiously. The sure sign of an amateur is he or she has a million plans and they all start tomorrow. Right? Resistance is tricky. It's not going to just break your will towards the calling and the thing that you're meant to do. It will just make you delay until literally time has run out. Now he transitions then to talking about life as a pro. And let's put some flesh on what this means. He says what happens when we turn pro is we finally listen to that still small voice inside our heads. At last, we find the courage to identify the secret dream or love or bliss that we have known all along was our passion, our calling, our destiny. Ballet, motorcycle maintenance, founding a clinic in the slums of Sao Paulo. This we acknowledge at last is what we are most afraid of. This is what we know in our hearts we have to do. So the pro begins to stop running from themselves and say, okay, I'm going to receive that this is what I was made to do, created to do. It scares me. There's no guarantee in success, but I'm going to live in this vulnerable pursuit of what I believe I was created to do. He says, when we turn pro, everything becomes simple. Our aim centers on the ordering of our days in such a way that we overcome the fears that have paralyzed us in the past. We now structure our hours not to flee from fear, but to confront it and overcome it. We plan our activities in order to accomplish an aim. We bring our will to bear so that we stick to the resolution. This changes our days completely. Changes when we get up, when we go to bed, our attitudes, all this. He says when we were amateurs, our life was about drama, about denial, and about distraction. Our days were simultaneously full to the bursting point and achingly, heartbreakingly empty. And I just think about times in my life and what I see in other people's lives, how many of us are living lives that are so full of activity, but so empty of meaning, so empty of true satisfaction, so empty of true joy and purpose. And he says that's the amateur way. But the pro is now living for something very, very difficult, but very, very meaningful. He says when we turn pro, when we make this decision, new people will appear in our lives. There'll be people who are facing their own fears, who are conquering them. These people will become our new friends. So new relationships will begin to develop. And I think that's an important thing to reflect on too, is to look at the relationships in our life and say, Are these relationships driving me forward? I love how one pastor said, he says, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. And whether we recognize it or not, the people, the environments that are in are constantly shaming us. This is why at our church, we're so passionate about getting people in groups and healthy biblical community, because we are being shaped by our community for better or for worse. And if I want my life to continue to move forward, I have to have people around me shaping me in the right way, because I'm going to be shaped by the people around me. It's just, is that a good shaping or a bad one? And that's something really, really important to think about and to reevaluate. Doesn't mean you don't have room in your life for those who are struggling and lose their way, but you have to manage the influence and the time and all those sorts of things and boundaries. He goes on, when you turn pro, he says turning pro is like kicking a drug habit or stopping drinking. It's a decision to which we must recommit every day, right? So every day, and maybe multiple times a day, the pro knows, like, I'm going to go through ups and downs. I'm going to get cold feet. I'm going to lose my drive. I'm going to struggle, but I'm going to keep going back to this decision to pursue this calling, to pursue this life that God has for me and has created and has called me to, and I'm not going to give up on it. So he then spends a lot more time digging into the professional life, and just a couple things that I love here that he says. He says, the pro has learned that the goddess prizes labor and dedication beyond any theatrical seeking of her favors. The professional does not wait for inspiration. He acts in anticipation of it. So the professional knows that I am not going to live by my feelings. I'm going to live by my decisions of who I'm deciding to be, right? If I wait till I feel like working out to work out, I'm not going to do it. If I wait till I feel like praying to pray, I'm not going to pray. If I wait till I feel like going to church, go to church, I'm not going to go. Because many times our feelings and our ambitions are not in line, our true ambitions. And if we follow our feelings, we're going to go down a very dark path. It's not that our feelings aren't important. They don't have a place. They do have a place, but it's not as the leader of our lives, right? It's our vision for our life. It's that unique calling that has to take that place. And then it's our intellect and our will that has to organize around it and say, hey, today I know you don't feel like praying and reading the scripture, but at the end of the day, you know you want to be a man after God's own heart. So whether you feel like it or not, you've got to do it because that's going to move you forward, and your habits are going to create your life. And so it's just this whole concept of don't, as John Maxwell says, feel yourself into acting, but act yourself into feeling. And the more that we choose the right action, our feelings will eventually follow. He goes on, he says, just along these lines, it seems counterintuitive, but it's true. In order to achieve flow, magic, the zone, whatever you want to call it, we start by being common and ordinary and workmanlike. We set our palms against the stones in the garden wall and search and search and search until at last, in the instant when we're ready to give up, our fingers fasten upon the secret door. So the ordinary rhythms, the mundane, are what really creates the extraordinary in our lives. I love how the Puritans used to write about this, and they were deeply religious people, but they prized above all what they called communion with God. And these are these kind of mountaintop experiences where you feel the presence of God in just a very powerful and real way. And this was not a frequent thing that would happen in people's lives. But they said, but the way that it does happen is through ordinary, mundane prayer and connection with God. And so in other words, the way that I think about it is like we're all trying to climb this mountain of connecting to God, of living our purpose. But most of that climb is not going to be a beautiful view. It's going to look like a muddy trail, and it's going to be tiring. And you're going to wonder, have I really made any progress? How much further do I go? But that ordinary climb then allows us sometimes to go to spots where the path opens up and we see the beautiful view, or the path opens up and we realize we're at the summit. We have these powerful moments. And so I think just spiritually, that's a great perspective to have, that many times I'm not going to feel this powerful reality of God, but if I stay in the ordinary, it will end up creating the path for that. I hope that makes sense. It's a powerful thought to me. Now, I love how Pressfield ends this book, and I love what he says just about this professional life, and I just want to read to you the ending. Just give me 1 second to flip there. He says this. He says, in the end, the enterprise and the sacrifices are all about the audience. They're about the readers, the moviegoers, the site visitors, the listeners, the concert goers, the gamers, the gallery goers, a group by which the way includes you and me. We're the audience. In the hero's journey, the wanderer returns home after years of exile, struggling and suffering. He brings a gift for the people. That gift arises from what the hero has seen, what he has endured, what he has learned. But the gift is not the raw material alone. It's the ore refined into gold by the hero, the wanderer, the artist's skilled and loving hands. You are that artist. The hero wanders, the hero suffers, the hero returns. You are that hero. And what I love about that, the way he ends it, is ultimately at the end of the day, what is in you, God has put in you to bless the world. Your calling matters. And to live out that calling, it is a hero's journey. You're going to have to fight. You're going to have to suffer. You're going to have to endure. You're going to have to be disciplined like a warrior. But if you choose that journey, not only do you get the blessing of becoming something different, but you bring back something to the world, to the people you love that only you can bring, and that will uniquely glorify God. So my encouragement to you and to me, let's live that hero journey. Let's turn pro. Let's put amateurish ways behind us. Let's fight resistance. And let's live that thing that God has called us to. Thank you for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you next episode.